February 15th, 1898. The U.S. battleship Maine sinks in Havana Harbor under mysterious circumstances. To this day, no one knows if it was an attack, sabotage, or just an accident. By this time, Cuban rebels have been fighting a revolutionary war against their Spanish rulers, and the United States was caught in between. American businesses had ties to Cuba that were threatened by the Spanish. The American public saw themselves in the Cuban rebels, as America had just had its own Revolutionary War 100 years prior. And of course, the U.S. military was down a battleship, and those with the loudest voices were calling out for Spanish blood. Hi, I'm Joey Dungerow, and this is Yellow Journalism and the Spanish-American War. What is yellow journalism? Well, the name comes from a comic strip character called the Yellow Kid, printed in the New York World, one of the newspapers we'll be discussing today. The World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, and the New York Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst, both became known for their outrageous and sensationalist facts and opinions on the conflict in Cuba. In Daniel Borson's book, The Image, Borson argues that almost all of the news we receive today are pseudo-events, or fabricated just to be sold and reported on. This idea fits in well with the way that Pulitzer and Hearst had their correspondents cover the Revolutionary War. So, in this way, reporters did not find the news or discover the news, they created the news. When I think of war, some of the first images that pop into my mind are that of soldiers, generals, battlefields, winners, and losers. These things are not pseudo-events. Cuban men and women laid down their lives for their convictions and their beliefs, and Spanish men died for theirs. But the way that the yellow journalists reported on and sensationalized reports and events coming out of Cuba was a pseudo-event. There's a famous exchange between Hearst and Frederick Remington, his reporter/illustrator based in Cuba at the time. Over telegram, Remington tells Hearst he wishes to return home, that there's no war, there's no story. Hearst replies that if Remington furnishes the pictures, he shall furnish the story. Developments in Cuba apparently weren't exciting enough for Pulitzer and Hearst, so they ramped up the excitement and fear factor in their papers. This violates the tenets of objectivity, as laid out in David Mindich's book, Just the Facts. Mindich argues that journalists should strive for objectivity in what they report. Objectivity has many factors, including detachment, balance, and facticity, all of which are left behind by yellow journalists. After the Maine's mysterious sinking, both Pulitzer and Hearst called for war against the Spanish for their treachery. They claimed that it had been Spanish intervention that sunk the vessel, and they even faked reports and statements from U.S. Navy personnel affirming that notion. The New York Journal ran a terribly colorful and bombastic illustration of the Maine's sinking on their front page. In addition to this, the Yellows gave much more coverage to the Cuban side of the war. They even got directly involved, with Hearst sending $2,000 worth of weapons and medical supplies to Cuban commanders. One of Pulitzer's correspondents, Sylvester Scoville, was considered a rebel agent by Spanish authorities, and they weren't wrong. Scoville carried messages back and forth from General Maximo Gomez of the rebel army to American forces. This type of involvement infringes on detachment, the idea being that, as a journalist, you want to get as far back from the story as possible, as to see the events as a fly on the wall. Scoville was literally aiding in the Cubans' war effort, thus transgressing balance, the idea that both sides, in some cases, should be given a fair viewing. Another event that stirred the American public towards war was reported on by Richard Harding Davis on his way back home. He met Clemencia Arango, sister of an insurgent leader. She told Davis that the Spanish had already searched her and her two female companions 3 times that day. Davis returned home and reported on the story with a few added embellishments. He claimed the women had been strip-searched by Spanish soldiers in broad daylight, which was false, and the accompanying picture only worked to sell the story harder. Notice also that the picture appears to depict a white woman, whereas the story centers around a Cuban woman. This would have fit closer to home to most Americans, as they would have been able to better identify with a white woman than with a woman of color. Davis also fails to mention that the 3 women were Cuban spies and turned out to have been carrying secret and undiscovered messages. Fortunately, not all newspapers in the States at the time were printing such vulgarities against the name of objectivity and journalistic integrity. Papers like the New York Herald and the New York Times took a more realistic approach when covering the war. The Herald published a facts and fakes about Cuba in order to steer readers away from the fantasies of the World and the Journal. Adolph Auck, editor of the Times, claimed in his inaugural speech his paper would be impartial, clean, dignified, and trustworthy. The motto of the New York Times was, "All the news that's fit to print." However, these moral high grounds did not pay well. At the height of the press circus during the war, the Times had a circulation of about 9,000. This does not compare well to the World's 600,000 papers. Many other newspapers in New York and across the country fell to the wayside in the wake of the immensely popular New York World and New York Journal. And that's what this is all about, isn't it? The desire to make money, to be successful, to be profitable enough to live beyond your means. These American dream-esque ideas can be certainly seen in the public's outcry for war against the Spanish. It's sad to think that a desire for money and fame is what spurs on war, but it's so true for our past, present, and our future. Which leads us to P.W. Singer and Emerson T. Brooking in their book, Like War, in which they argue that advances in technology, especially in our digital age, have changed the way in which people wage war and conflict with one another. Now, the journalists covering the Cuban Revolutionary War didn't have text messages or tweets, but they did have the telegraph and the radio. Now, I'm not saying that technologies themselves were responsible for stirring the American people into Congress into declaring war, but without the speed the radio provided, and of course the printing press, which spread yellow journalism like a disease, the pseudo-events would not have taken hold as well as they did. Ultimately, it was how Pulitzer and Hearst used the information that was given to them by their correspondents. The Spanish-American War is a little chapter of U.S. history I think a lot of us would like to forget. The shameful and foolish way we intervened in the war we really had no business in being in isn't something we'd like to remember as being a part of our legacy. However, it is very important to remember one's motivations and ideals when reporting on a story, especially one as volatile and deadly as a war or a revolution.